I'm Effie, this is What Effie Reads, and in this video I'm going to be doing a wee wrap up of all of the books that I read in the months April, May and June. And this is my second attempt at trying to record this video. So, as I mentioned in the intro, I've already recorded this video once, but as I was editing it, I didn't like the way that it was going. And I also had a conversation with Shannon over Head in the Books, and she suggested that I try and wrap up all of my books for this quarter in 45 minutes. Now that sounds like a lot of time, but I have 108 books to go through, plus if I get a chance at the end, I've also got 9 DNFs. So I guess we'll just see how I get on with it. What I'm going to do is I will set a timer for 45 minutes, and when that timer runs out, I will stop talking about the books. Every book mentioned in this video is going to be listed in the description. So if you want to find out more about these books, then there'll be a list down below. Before I get into talking about all of the books that I read in those 3 months, let's go to Effie from earlier today, where I talked about some stats for the books that I completed in the second quarter of the year. So, as I've already mentioned, I completed 108 books in the months of April to June. The breakdown of how many books I read each month is as follows. I read 37 books in April, 36 books in May and 35 books in June. And I think I'm going to be lucky if I read 10 books in July. Yay, mental health! Overall, I had 22 5 stars, 36 between 4 and 5, 34 between 3 and 4, 12 between 2 and 3, 3 between 1 and 2, and 1 book that I gave less than a 1-star rating to. Of the books that I read, 61 were audiobooks, 29 I read physically, 12 I read as ebooks, and 6 I read in a mixture of different formats. I got 46 of the books from Scribd. 1 of the books was an owned audiobook. 22 of the books were owned physical books. 1 book was an owned ebook. 12 were from Kindle Unlimited. 3 I got through the Audible Plus subscription. 13 of the books I borrowed from my local library. And 10 of the books I got through NetGalley. The series breakdown is as follows. 55 of the books were standalones, 29 of the books were starting a series, 21 of the books were continuing a series, and 3 of the books were finishing a series. And the breakdown of new to me versus authors I've read from previously is 64 new to me authors and 44 authors that I'd read from before. However, there might be duplicate entries in the authors I'd read from before category. And I'm back! Hi! So, first thing we need to do is set a timer. So, Alexa, set timer for 45 minutes.
45 minutes, starting now.
Okay, and let's see how many I can get through. The first 8 books I'm going to kind of talk about together. So they are part of a series, but it's a series that's got like a first series and a second series, and I only read the second series. However, these books are somewhat problematic. Basically, the overall series title is Spirit Animals, which I think gives you a clue about just why these books are problematic. The basic premise is children form these bonds with animals and they become their spirit animals. It's all just a bit icky, and like there's really no reason why the person that came up with this idea, I cannot remember who it is. This was a series that had multiple different authors writing the books, but it had one author that came up with the overall concept and wrote the overall story, I believe. But yeah, there's no reason why they had to name it that and try and co-opt this thing that Indigenous communities in North America have said people shouldn't be trying to co-opt because it's a closed practice and it's specific to their culture. And I think what makes it even more frustrating in my head anyway is I've seen very similar concepts that don't get called this. Like if you think of in the Game of Thrones series where you've got warging, I think it's called, where you've got these humans that are connecting with animals. That's a very similar concept. And also just going back to kind of traditional witchy folklore type thing, you've got witches and their familiars. So not great. Like if you're able to take away the problematic aspect, which obviously you can't because books do not operate in a vacuum and like you have to assess the book as a whole package. I would say these books are kind of middle grade, like they're very much of a certain period of time. But so those 8 books are Immortal Guardians by Eliot Schrefer, Broken Ground by V. Schwab, The Burning Tide by Jonathan Auxier, Heart of the Land by Sarah Prineas, The Return by Varian Johnson, Storm Speaker by Cristina Diaz Gonzalez, The Wildcat's Claw by Varian Johnson, and The Dragon's Eye by Sawa Chadha. Next up, in a much more positive note, I read 4 books by Alix Gino. 3 of those 4 books were queer and they just have a really warm, fuzzy feeling to them. Obviously, they're dealing with the issues that queer people face, but they're middle grade, so they've got that warmer feeling and they're just lovely and fuzzy. And the 4th one tackles intersectionality, and I could appreciate that it does what it intends to do. In Gino's author's note, at the end of it, they talk about the fact that this book was intended for a white middle grade audience to kind of open up those discussions about intersectionality for children of that age that don't necessarily understand the concept, and also gives them an introduction to things like privilege. And I think it was done really well. So that book that talks about intersectionality is You Don't Know Everything, Jilly P. And the 3 queer books I read were Melissa, Rick, and Alice Austen Lived Here. The next book I would like to talk about is These Feathered Flames by Alexandra Overy. I wanted to love it. I think it had a lot of really promising things, but my 2 main issues were the ending just didn't feel right as an ending for me. I don't know, like it didn't give quite enough resolution, but also like it felt like it ended at a very random point. I believe this is going to be a duology, so obviously there is more to the story, but there's a way of ending a book in a series or in a duology that gives you some satisfaction, and I didn't get that from this book. I also didn't enjoy the queer relationship. It had a lot of potential, but the way that they flip-flopped between being able to trust them and not being able to trust them just didn't sit well with me. There's a certain number of twists that you can have in a book before it just becomes tedious and you're like, I just don't care anymore. And unfortunately, that's what this book was. Back to books that I adored, and I read volumes 1 to 3 of Heartstopper by Alice Oseman. This was a reread for me. I absolutely love this series. I think it's such a cute graphic novel, and I really appreciate that not only does it have the queer rep, but it also has the mental health rep. And whilst my mental health difficulties are different from the ones that Charlie's facing, this is a series that I think I would have really appreciated when I was a queer teen struggling with my mental health. Like, I would have loved to have seen that representation, and it just fills my heart with so much joy that queer teens now have this. Another queer series that I absolutely adore, we've got the Fractured Fables series by Alix E. Harrow. The first book is A Spindle Splintered, and the second book is A Mirror Mended. I think both of these books are really well done. I love the way that they bring these fairy tales into kind of a modern scenario and twist and turn with them. I love how they comment on what the fairy tales are teaching, and also the way that it looks back at the different variations on these fairy tales. I think that's really cool and interesting. I did like A Mirror Mended more, but that's largely because I loved the sapphic relationship at the centre of the story, and the evil queen is just everything. I love her so much. Next up, we've got a short story collection called You Should Pity Us Instead by Amy Gustine. I can't remember too much about this collection other than being disappointed and feeling like the stories just needed an extra paragraph or so to round them up. It felt like you got a reveal or almost got a reveal, and then it was straight on to the next story, and it just didn't quite work for me. Another short story collection that I read was Blackout by Dhonielle Clayton, Angie Thomas, Tiffany D. Jackson, Nicola Yoon, Ashley Woodfolk, and Nick Stone. This takes place at the height of summer during a blackout, and we've got these 6 stories that interconnect throughout, and they're all kind of beautiful black love stories. I did generally enjoy it. I wasn't the biggest fan of Dhonielle Clayton's story, but otherwise I was really pleasantly surprised, as I'd heard not the best reviews for this book, but I did end up really quite enjoying it, and I look forward to the sequel. I want to say it's called Whiteout, but I could be wrong. Next up, we've got Out of Character by Annabeth Albert. This is a queer contemporary romance where a guy that works in a comic book store has to team up with a guy that you wouldn't think of being a fan of geeky things to try and get these rare collector's cards after the non-geeky guy ends up betting away his brother's set. It's such a cute romance, and it's just so enjoyable to follow the boys along on their mission. In My Dreams I Hold a Knife by Ashley Winstead is set around a college reunion where people are trying to get answers on the murder of one of their classmates a decade ago. Overall, it was an interesting enough story, and I liked how you didn't get the full picture until you saw every character's culpability. But I did think that there was a couple of characters that were written quite similarly, and they had quite similar names. I also thought the ending had 1 or 2 twists too many, but I'm definitely going to be on the lookout for Winstead's next book, which I think comes out later this year. The King is Dead by Benjamin Dean I absolutely adored. It follows the UK's first black monarch who also happens to be gay. There's quite a lot of grief in this book, but also there's this brilliant queer romance that you're just thoroughly rooting for. And the ending, oof, I love the ending so much. Great book. Please go check it out if you haven't already. The Empress Babe by Bernardine Evaristo was a book that I really wanted to like, but I had a lot of difficulty getting a sense of time and place with it. Sometimes I thought it took place in the past, sometimes I thought it took place in the present, possibly even could have taken place in the future. I wasn't sure if it was in London, if it was somewhere in Italy. It was very confusing, and not being able to find my feet meant that I couldn't really follow the story. On the other end of things, we've got Honey and Spice by Bolu Babalola. This is a black love story between two university students. It's kind of enemies to lovers, but like they're not that enemy-ish to each other. At the start of it, they just see each other as being very different people. So you've got Kiki, who is a radio host, and you've got Malachi, who wants to become a filmmaker, and they decide to fake date, which I love fake dating, to try and get content for their respective projects. And then, as is always the way with fake dating, their feelings become less fake as it progresses. I loved the banter in this book was absolutely spot on. There was a real flavour of the African diaspora. It was just such a banging story. And this is a romance that I can see people that don't normally gravitate towards romance liking. There's minimal spice to it, but the spicy scenes that are within it read like poetry. It's so good. The Moment We Met and Have We Met by Camille Baker are two companion novels, and they revolve around a dating app called Met, with the kind of unique selling point that it can tell you if you've met your soulmate. And if you haven't already met your soulmate, it can give you an alert when you meet potential soulmates. I thought the protagonists in these stories were really strong. The love interests were fantastic. Both of them were a little bit queer, and I liked the way that it dealt with grief, not in a heavy way, but in a optimistic, moving forward, accepting grief as part of kind of daily life sort of way. Brilliant books. Absolutely love. Again, if you like a romance, these are a very good shout. I, Antigone by Carlo Gebler is the Oedipus trilogy, told from Antigone's point of view. I thought this was a really unique perspective, and I loved the way that it was so unflinching in telling the Oedipus trilogy. If you're a fan of Greek mythology, this is definitely one to check out. And I will just give a warning because it does not shy away from the very rough parts of the mythos. The Vanishing Triangle by Claire McGowan is a non-fiction where McGowan explores the disappearances of some women within a triangular area of Ireland. This is not a true crime book that gives you resolution to their stories, although there are suggestions about some of the potential suspects. However, it's kind of like hinted that you go online and check it out because McGowan can't include them in the book for legal reasons. But what this book really does is it takes a look at the systems that are in place that have meant that these women have not had their cases resolved. It's absolutely heartbreaking, but so poignant and just so well written as a whole. I also read a fiction from Claire McGowan. It follows a group of people who met at a new parents group, and you're following them after one of them has supposedly fallen from a balcony at a party celebrating one of the children, and you're trying to get to the bottom of what actually happened. It was a fairly standard thriller. It was one of those where you can enjoy the ride, you can form theories as you go along, and then once you close it, you don't really think too much about it. But if you're a fan of thrillers, it's a good one to pick up. The next book on my list is one that I was a little bit nervous to pick up, and it's Witchlings by Clarabelle A. Ortega. The reason that I was nervous of picking this up is that I had such high hopes of Ghost Squad and it just didn't live up to my expectations. So I was worried that the same would happen with this book. However, it is absolutely brilliant. It's so well written. I love that every little detail has been thought about, and I can't wait to read the sequel, which I believe involves toad racing, which I think is going to be really interesting. Basically, you're following a group of young witches who are being sorted into their coven, and the ones who are not sorted into a coven are called spares, and they are stigmatized within their community. However, they can take on a so-called impossible task to try and gain status. Homecoming by Colin Grant tells the story of the Windrush generation in their own voices. My primary issue with this book is very much a me issue rather than an actual issue with the book, in that there is an expectation that you go into the book having a foundation of knowledge about Windrush, and unfortunately I don't have that. I know the very barest bones about Windrush, but really don't know enough that I would get context for what these people that were part of the Windrush generation are actually talking about. I feel like I maybe got 50% of what I could out of this book because I was really relying on context clues, but what I needed was that foundational knowledge. And again, that's the problem with me, not with this book. I clearly went in with the wrong expectations. The next three books I highly recommend to anyone who is a fan of urban fantasy, and especially if you are a fan of queer urban fantasy. And they are the Adam Lee Binder series by David R. Slayton. The first book is Trailer Park Trickster. The second book is White Trash Warlock. And the third book is Deadbeat Druid. These books follow Adam Lee Binder, who grew up on a trailer park and has a minimal amount of magic. However, he's sucked further into the world of magic when his sister-in-law is corrupted by a demon, I believe it is. I just think the relationship in this is absolutely beautiful. I would die for Vic. I love him to pieces. And the magic system's so cool. It's tarot based, so you've got things like the Queen of Swords, who is an elf, and she's depicted as having all these swords all over her. But when she's not showing all of her swords, she's dressed like a 1920s flapper. And then her brother is dressed in a suit, looking really suave. It's such a cool world. And as I say, I love the central romance as well. It's so good. The third book is inspired by Orpheus. So if you like that, you will love this book. Blood Sign by Deborah Falaye is a Yoruba mythology inspired fantasy where certain people have the power inherited from gods and they have to hide that power from everyone. in their communities. However, one of these people is conscripted. I don't know if that's the right word. Basically forced into the army, which is the very worst place that she can be. And it just adds further pressure as she has to try and hide it whilst in the most dangerous place that could be for her. Written in my own heart's blood and A Leaf on the Wind of All Hallows by Diana Gabaldon are two more books in the Outlander series. They are quite far into the series, so I'm not going to say too much about them, but I will say that I'm continuing to enjoy following Jamie and Claire's story. A Leaf on the Wind of All Hallows actually follows a side character, so I enjoyed it a little bit less because I do prefer the stories where you are following Jamie and Claire. But I'm loving their overall story, and I'm a bit scared that I've only got one more book before I am fully caught up on this series. Caitlin and the Highlander by Diana Knightley is kind of like an Outlander ripoff, but rather than the person from the present going back in time, the person from the past comes forward in time. Because I have Outlander to compare it to, I didn't think it was quite as good as Outlander, but it was interesting enough, a little bit insta-lovey in places, but I love that it is a 16 book series. I don't know if that's it complete or if there's more books to come, but I love that it is a massive series that I'm able to get stuck into when I get a chance, and I do plan on continuing it because I feel intrigued enough to continue. The Butterfly Garden, The Roses of May, The Summer Children and The Vanishing Season, all by Dot Hutchinson, are the collector series. In this series, we are following a group of FBI agents as they are trying to get to the bottom of some horrible crimes that have been committed against children. I found them really interesting. The Butterfly Garden starts off really strong as we're following the story of this guy who kidnaps these girls and then tattoos butterflies on their back and keeps them as his own personal butterfly collection. And it gets darker than that. I really, really enjoyed it. I was interested to see how the story would progress, as it felt like it wrapped up nicely. But there's such a cool overarching story arc from book 1 to book 4. I loved seeing all of the characters' growth and seeing where their lives went in general. And I was really sad when I got to the end of book 4 to say goodbye to these characters. But I really enjoyed the series and actually want to get physical copies because I loved the series that much. The Last Good Funeral of the Year by Ed O'Loughlin. I picked this up thinking it was going to be fiction, and in fact it's non-fiction. It's a year in the life starting just before the start of the pandemic, and then obviously spanning until a little bit into the pandemic. It's kind of experimental in places. It's dealing with grief. It's dealing with isolation. I think basically it wasn't the book I thought it was when I picked it up, so it ended up disappointing me. Circus of Wonders by Elizabeth McNeil follows a young woman who has kind of spots all over her and she's sold into a freak show. This book was really good at openly exploring the darker side of freak shows, and it mentions a lot of real life people who were involved in these. What I didn't enjoy about this book were the pacing felt a bit off, and also the central romance. I think there was a 10 to 15 year age gap between them. Nellie, who is the younger of them, I think she's 19. So that is quite a considerable age gap, and I just couldn't get on board with it. It just gave me the ick. Plain Bad Heroines by Emily M. Danforth was just plain bad. I really, really didn't like it. I did prefer the past storyline to the present storyline. There was some elements in the present one that I liked a bit better. I liked that it was really sapphic, but it just didn't interest me. And then the ending just felt very wishy-washy. Would not recommend, especially because it's like that thick. Mallory Tower's First Term by Enid Blyton. This was a reread for me because I remembered loving it as a kid, and now I wonder what I ever saw in it because it is plain bad. I mean, I've just said that about the previous book, but this book is really bad. You've basically got this young girl, so she's in her first year of secondary school, so I'm going to say she's around 12 years old, who's being horrendously bullied. And then rather than the bullies facing consequences, she ends up facing consequences because inevitably she's a 12-year-old, she's being bullied, she ends up lashing out. And every single character in the book is really cruel to her, including the adults that should know better. And I believe at one point they basically say it serves her right that she's being bullied. It's just so out of order, and I hated it with a passion. I Know What I Am by Gina Siciliano. This follows the story of Artemisia Gentileschi, who was a painter in, I don't know, about the 1600s, I think, 1500s, 1600s. I think my primary issue with this was that the author tried to give too much of an overarching picture, and it felt like you got the history of every single character that happened to pop up in this story, when really I wanted the focus to be on Artemisia. I also didn't feel as empowered as it felt like it should have been. Now, I don't know if that's because her life story wasn't actually that empowering, but I felt like it was sold to me as being a bit more empowering than it was. Queen of the Tiles by Hannah Olcath. I picked this up because I had to read a book that Kayla over at Books and Lala liked. I enjoyed it. It's a young girl trying to get to the bottom of her best friend's death at the previous Scrabble tournament. I thought it was really well done, and the mystery held a lot of intrigue. I also didn't realise that it didn't take place in America. I want to say it takes place in Malaysia, but I could be miles off there. Very much enjoy it. Recommend it if you like that kind of genre, like YA mystery type thing with lots of contemporary elements. Very well written. She and I by Hannah King follows two best friends after they wake up with one of the friends' boyfriends murdered. Told through around 5 points of view, you are slowly unravelling what happened and how the boyfriend ended up dead. I went into the book pretty sure I knew who the killer was because I briefly met the author at Granite Noir earlier in the year, and based on a very, very brief conversation, I got an impression of from whose perspective the prologue was, and that gave me an impression of who was the killer. My theory ended up being correct, but it was very interesting to see those building blocks slip into place and see what led up to the boyfriend's death. The one big issue I had with this book was the amount of fat phobia. I was not on board for it at all. The Keeper Chronicles by J.A. Andrews is a fantasy following this group of people called keepers. They have magic, but they're also kind of the storytellers of the realm. There's lots of really cool magical things. There's dragons, there's big baddies using magic for evil. Very, very enjoyable trilogy. I enjoyed it a lot more than I think I expected going in. And it was really nice to follow these characters along for this whole trilogy. And I'm definitely going to be reading more in this world of the Keepers. Meet Cute Club by Jack Harbon was a very short and sweet gay romance. Not really sure there's much else I can say on that. The Haunting of Bonaventure Circus by Jamie Jo Wright. It didn't leave much of an impression. I had similar issues to the ones that I had with Plain Bad Heroines. One of the timelines was a bit more interesting than the other, but both of them were kind of boring. Chef's Kiss by Gerard Melendez follows a recently graduated young man as he tries to find a job. Everywhere requires experience, so he ends up working at a restaurant. He ends up really loving it at the restaurant and may also fall for one of his co-workers. There's also a pig character that I think everyone who picks up this comic is going to absolutely love, and if for no other reason, pick this comic up for the pig. Medusa by Jessie Burton is a fantastic feminist retelling of the Medusa myth, and it has beautiful artwork throughout. I'm going very quickly because I feel like my time's running out, so apologies if you're not getting much info. Please do comment about any of these books if you want more thoughts, and I will make sure I keep an eye on the comments, I promise. Girls Can Kiss Now by Jill Gutowitz. This was a collection of essays talking about growing up queer in the early 2000s and late 90s. The author is a lesbian. I am a queer non-binary person, but I could see a lot of commonality. A lot of the cultural touchstones were very similar, so I identified a lot with what the author was saying, and I really enjoyed this collection of essays, which is a rarity. I don't generally like essay collections, but this one was fantastic. The Princess Plan by Julia London takes place in Regency/Victorian London. It's okay. It has a made-up country that I didn't enjoy. I don't like made-up countries in not made-up worlds, but it was okay. Like, it was very bog-standard historical romance in my mind. Orgy by Caitlin Greenidge. I remember literally nothing about it, so let's just move on. Witch Hat Atelier Volume 2 by Komomo Shihara. This is a very cutesy manga that follows a young person as they find out how magic exists and they are taken on as an apprentice. There's kind of an overarching big bad, but it's just a lovely, sweet, wholesome kind of manga that features magic. I really enjoy it. I'm slowly working my way through the volumes. Confessions by Kane Minato. This took me by surprise. I did not expect to be so shocked by it. This follows a teacher who finds out 2 of her students were responsible for her daughter's death, so decides to give one last lesson, and just the whole book was a complete surprise to me. I really enjoy it, and I'd like to read more from this author. Last Night by Valerie McFarlane. This was billed as a romance, and having read it, I went back and looked at listings of it because I was like, this is not a romance. This is so far from a romance. But every listing seemed to say that it was a romance. Maybe that's the way it's been billed in the UK. I don't know. But I definitely would not say it's a romance. Yes, it does have romance elements in it, but this book is a lot closer to being like a literary fiction. This book is more focused on grief, and really crushing grief at that. And whilst I did enjoy this book, there was an element of, I went into it expecting a romance. I went into it expecting a second chance sweet romance, and what I got was a crushing book about grief. And I hate with a fiery passion that it is billed as a romance, because this is so far from a romance. And that's the timer. Alexa, stop. Since I have run out of time, what I'm going to do is I am going to literally give you title and author for the rest of the books that I read during the quarter. And as I said earlier, if you want my thoughts on any of these books, please comment down below and I am more than happy to talk about them. And I promise I will keep an eye on the comments. I know I'm not always the quickest to reply, but I will be keeping a very close eye on the comments for this video. Also, let me know if you like this concept and want me to do it more with my wrap-ups, because at least at the moment I'm having a horrendous number of books to have to wrap up. So, excuse me whilst I look down to read these titles. I hope that's okay. The remaining books are as follows. Sensible Footwear by Kate Charlesworth. The Embroidered Book by Kate Hartfield. Sorry for Your Loss by Kate Marshall. Clara and the Sun by Kazuo Ishiguro. Taproot by Kizzy Young. Things We Say in the Dark by Kirsty Logan. The Keeper of Night by Kylie Lee Baker. Inconvenient Daughter by Lauren J. Sharkey. How to Kill Your Best Friend by Lexi Eliot. Teen Killers Club by Lily Sparks. The Paris Apartment by Lucy Foley. All Your Little Lies by Marianne Holmes. At the End of Everything by Marika Nishkamp. Battle Royale Volume 8 by Masayuki Taguchi and Kosun Takami. Our Not So Lonely Planet Travel Guide Volume 1 by Monet Sarai. Chivalry by Neil Gaiman. Empress of Salt and Fortune by Ni Vo. When the Tiger Came Down the Mountain by Ni Vo. The Hangman's Daughter by Oliver Perch. The Lady's Guide to Celestial Mechanics by Olivia Waite. My Sister the Serial Killer by Oyukan Braithwaite. Divine by Mistake by PC Cast. In the Eyes of Mr. Fury by Philip Ridley. Red Rising by Pierce Brown. Between the Lines by Rachel Lacey. See You Tomorrow by Rachel Lynn Solomon. Laura Olympus by Rachel Smith. Ethel and Ernest by Raymond Briggs. In the Shadow of the Red Brick Building by Raymond Tony Charlie. The Bone Witch by Rin Chapeko. Everyone Knows Your Mother is a Witch by Rivka Galchen. First Year Out by Sabrina Symington. Marble Cake by Scott Jason Smith. The School of Good and Evil by Soman Chainani. The Seven Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle by Stuart Turton. Mini Minority Monsters by Tab Kimpton. This Woven Kingdom by Tahara Mathi. Search a Freak Omnibus Volume 1 by Takahiro Arai and Darren Shan. Grown by Tiffany D. Jackson. Are You Listening by Tilly Walden. Never Evers by Tom Ellen and Lucy Iverson. The Shadows Between Us by Trisha Levenseller. A Darker Shade of Magic by V. Schwab. Death Blooms by Yolanda Olsen. Breeding Lilacs by Alice LaRue. 5 Seconds Before a Witch Falls in Love by Zeniko Sumia. Vampires Never Get Old, edited by Zoraida Cordova and Natalie C. Parker. And that is the list of all the books I completed. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you don't want any further thoughts on any of the books, let me know your best and worst books that you've read in the second quarter of the year. Feel free to include July as well if you'd like. And until next time, bye!
There's a place